Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tutsi Dombo. On behalf of Invest Africa, I would like to welcome you to this afternoon's session, Charting the Course, South Africa's Political Landscape in 2024. I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to join us for what should be a very riveting conversation. I would like to introduce our moderator for this afternoon's session, Ms. Gabrielle Reid from SRM Strategic Intelligence. She is the Associate Director, and she will be running the conversation this morning. In regards to housekeeping, you will find that there is a Q&A chat box at the bottom of your screen. If you could please populate your questions as the event commences. Thank you. Gabby?
Great, thanks, Tutsi. Thank you all for joining today's fireside chat, Charting the Course, South Africa's Political Landscape in 2024. As Tutsi mentioned, my name is Gabby Reid, and I am the Associate Director for Strategic Intelligence at SRM, the global intelligence consultancy, and Invest Africa's proud intelligence partner for 2024. And I have the fantastic opportunity to moderate today's session. We are exactly 2 weeks out from Election Day on the 29th of May, and I think it's fair to say that for the first time since South Africa's first democratic elections in 1994, the governing African National Congress Party's prospects for an outright majority of the vote are at their lowest. Growing criticism of the party over poor service delivery, allegations of corruption, and South Africa's electricity challenges, alongside a dampened economic growth forecast, has introduced significant uncertainty regarding the party's performance in the upcoming ballot. These factors, in addition to some party infighting and growth among the new opposition players, including the Economic Freedom Fighters, and of course, the newcomer, the MK Party, could see the ANC fall below the 50% mark for the first time, necessitating a coalition government. Now, many agree that the outcome of the 2024 national elections, specifically whether the ANC will secure this majority in parliament or will require a coalition, and the makeup of that coalition will have significant impact on South Africa's political future and commercial environment. So to take us through the complexities of all this, and to help us chart the course of South Africa's political landscape in 2024, I'm joined by an esteemed panel of speakers, including Kuseni Dlamini, Chairperson of Alex Forbes and Aspen Pharamcare Holdings, Junior Ngulube, Chairperson of the Board for Marsh Africa, Nicky Weimar, the Chief Economist at Nedbank, and Aurelien Mali, Senior Analytical Advisor for Africa at Moody's Investor Services. Welcome all, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Just to kick us off, we've got a lot to get through today, covering almost as much ground as I think the national candidates list might. So can I ask each panelist in their responses to keep them as sharp as possible and to the questions noted. I hope not to, but I will interject if needed, just to ensure that everyone gets a sort of fair share to share their insights with us today, and hopefully we can have a fairly free-flowing discussion. So I think to kick us off, I want to come to you, Aurelien, for a global take in the first instance. Perhaps you can set the scene on where South Africa is today within this global context, and what are some of the key issues that South Africa is facing as we enter the election period?
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Gabrielle. I think it's important to look at South Africa. Moody's ratings has had a rating on the sovereign for 30 years now, and it is at the lowest point it has been throughout the period. In fact, I like to remind people that the country was rated A3 by Moody's in foreign currency, in 2009, and now it's rated Ba2 with a stable outlook, which is 5 notches lower than 2009. And this deterioration in the credit profile has really, if you want, embedded all the weakening of the South African credit profile. And I would say that today, South Africa is at the crossroad, and the new administration, whatever its form, a coalition or not, will inherit stubborn credit constraints. So when I say that, I want to make it clear that this is issues that will still weigh negatively on the credit profile of South Africa for the years or even decade to come. So the first one, I will mention four very quickly. The first one is the low growth potential. South Africa, growth potential is estimated between 1 and 1.5%, which is very low, and it's constrained by network infrastructure, namely the energy, as you know, with the lack of energy availability, but also the logistic sector. And this lead to more unemployment and increase the social risk. There has been incremental progress, but it's still far from being solved. And so this is the first limiting credit constraint. The second one is, and I think everybody in South Africa is aware of it, is the weaker state of public finance. The debt of the government was 20% of GDP in 2020-something% of GDP in 2009. It's between 75 and 80% of GDP today. All tiers of government have some difficulties. The municipalities are accumulating arrears to Eskom, for example, and the fiscal space has declined. And clearly, this is an issue that is difficult to change. So in the case of South Africa, on top of that, there are some rigidities in both the revenue side and the infrastructure. So fiscal consolidation is likely to remain, and you will still have a lot of spending pressure on the budget from social demand or capital expenditure. Final risk on the public finance will be the risk emanating from the SOEs. The bailout of Eskom is the latest example, with also the facility for Transnet. A third key constraint is the shift to cleaner energy. As you know, this is something where the government published a Just Transition Investment Plan that is estimated to 98 billion, and it looks even more challenging to implement today. You still have some other ESG consideration, water management, as you know, the physical climate risk. They will still be on the table for discussion to try to find mitigants going forward. And the final constraint that I would mention is to maintain the attractiveness of South Africa for capital inflows, foreign capital inflows, given the weaker credit fundamental and the dependence the country has. This is something that is really important for the country that runs current account deficit. A large chunk of the government debt is owned by non-residents. The weaker credit fundamental for the moment have been reflected through an adjustment of the exchange rate. I would say that the reappointment of the governor send a signal that there should be policy continuity, but this is something that is important in the case of South Africa. So there is a lot of uncertainty and noise at the moment. For us, the important element will be the document that will run the coalition, if there is one, that will set the policy mix. And so this is where South Africa is at the moment, and these constraints are again likely to be stubborn.
Well, thank you for painting that picture for us. I think it's very clear that whoever the government of the day is, there's a number of key challenges that they're going to have to face head on. And, you know, on that point, trying to understand, given the current uncertainty around the election, who the government of the day is going to be. Perhaps, Nicky, you can take us to the sort of more national level view on things you're seeing that will come to shape the election outcome, and of course some of the implications for the country's macroeconomic picture post-election?
All right, so I get the difficult question, who the government will be. It's really impossible to answer, but the way we've approached it at Nedbank and the way we've sort of looked at it is saying, you know, there are three possible scenarios. One is that despite a prolonged period of economic stagnation, despite the very bad experience of almost over a decade of state capture, and despite a very significant deterioration in the state's capacity, and therefore also in the quality of service delivery to the public, the ANC still somehow manages to scrape by and get that majority. You know, 1% more than 50 is a waste of drinking time, as they say. So in that sort of situation, I think we have more of the same. And the key will then be to see if they make progress with the structural reforms they themselves have announced. Then the other option for us is that the ANC does lose its outright majority. The discontent of the last 2 decades manifest in that. But they still get a vote of above 40%, and that makes it possible for them to form a coalition with a group of smaller parties. And if you look at how the smaller parties are polling at the moment, it should be fairly easy to get there. So it is doable. And as we understand it, this is the preference of the ANC as well, if the situation was to materialize. In that case, you know, I also think you're going to have more of the same. The ANC will be the dominant party. Small parties will be given an opportunity that they might not otherwise get. But I think that the ANC will pretty much still call the shots. And then the third possibility is, of course, the situation where their support falls below 40. And recent polling suggests that they are kind of at that 40 level. They are hovering near that critical mark, in which case they might need a larger party to form a coalition. And there are 2 large parties, the DA and the EFF. And the EFF obviously closer to them from a policy perspective, although contains in their manifesto an enormous amount of extremely radical policies. And then the DA, of course, much more IMF, World Bank, standard conventional macroeconomic policies that they suggest. From our perspective, it would probably be best if the ANC and the DA could form a coalition, but we think that unlikely. So then the EFF does come into the fray, and that could have very significant consequences. We just don't know what. That is the problem. It is the uncertainty about it. It depends, as Aurelien said, you know, it depends on what is the agreement by which you govern, who's in charge of what ministry, what sort of power and freedom is given to the EFF. The ANC will still be the dominant party, and therefore their policy agenda would still be the one that should dominate. But that is, of course, where the big uncertainty comes through. From a macroeconomic perspective, I've got to say there's some positive movements. We're sort of crawling in the right direction as far as that's concerned over the last, I'd say, 2 years. You know, government has announced certain sensible structural reforms, but they have also struggled, really struggled to implement these expediently. And while at the same time heading in that direction, they have also continued to embrace some really damaging policies. A good example of that would be what transpired yesterday when the National Health Insurance Program was signed in to law, and now leaves that sector really with a huge cloud of uncertainty hanging over it, with very significant implications for ordinary South Africans. So it's always been this situation where you've got some damaging policies combined with some sensible policies, but the implementation of the sensible policies appear to have been a very slow crawl. And so as a result, you know, our growth is extremely limited. We are at a very vulnerable point. We do not have a lot of macroeconomic policy space, as the previous speakers already pointed out. And that means that, any wrong direction, I think we will be punished. We will certainly see it in capital flows. We'll see it in the currency. That has implications for inflation, which has implications for interest rates, and ultimately comes back to tighten the grip on the overall economy. And I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's clear that there is sort of a best case and worst case scenario for business, specifically in terms of coalition politics in South Africa. But of course, it's going to take a while to secure that overarching agreement within which a coalition agrees to govern. And what will come down to implementation of policy as much as it will come down to the policy of the day. Appreciate that much of our audience on this call is obviously from the business community. So perhaps I can come over to you, Junior, and get a sense from the perspective of the business community. What's keeping senior stakeholders or business stakeholders awake at night when it comes to this particular election?
Thank you very much, Gabi. And what is interesting is everyone so far has mentioned one word several times, and that word is uncertainty. I think this is the one word that is keeping business people awake at night as we head towards these elections. I think also one has to look at it in terms of what has happened on the continent with let's call them independence or liberation parties. They start off very popular. We can see it in our neighboring countries, and they slide sometimes into oblivion. I'm not saying it's going to be the case here, but the decrease in popularity is self-evident. And this is what is taking us now into these uncharted waters, as it were, and hence the uncertainty in the business community. Business needs certainty within which to make their strategic decisions. And once implemented, business is committed, in many instances, long-term to these strategies. And what business fears most after that is what I would call the risk of change. That's what we are facing at this point. And this change could be at the political level, change in political parties. Nicky has touched on that. Or within the same political framework, a change in policy. And this could happen whether we have a coalition or not. And Nicky have already mentioned the NHI. This is a classical risk of change. Where businesses have developed over many years and perfected over many years business models that have been functioning successfully, and then suddenly there is a change in policy. This is quite a serious risk for business. I was looking at the papers not so long ago, the impact on the healthcare sector. Since March, Discovery is down 7%. And since the start of the year, it is down 22%. And quite honestly, this is real destruction of value. And for business, this is a serious risk. And there could be other policy changes post-elections that could have such a direct impact on business model. So yes, I would say the risk of change is uppermost in most of business executives' minds as we speak. But of course, as risk managers, we also have to think as we normally do in terms of what could go wrong. Mm-hmm. I mean, I personally don't foresee a July 2021 scenario at all. But one also then starts thinking, what if the elections are contested? We've seen this in quite a few of our neighboring states. We've seen the IEC being quite busy of late. One would prefer them to be boring, but they've been quite busy in the courts. And with so many parties, big and small, and even individual candidates, what is the potential of one of these contesting the results? And it doesn't need to be one of the big ones. That could lead to quite some risky environment, maybe a bit of chaos as well. But I think overall, I'm quite comfortable. I think post-election, we'll see what some have called some gentle winds of change, but nothing that's going to take our roofs off. And the markets have probably pressed this in already. And to me, it looks like the rand is oblivious of the elections. It just chugs along and has strengthened of late. That's what I see, Gabi, and thanks a lot.
Well, thank you, Gino. I want to bring Kuseni in here just to give you the opportunity to speak to you, also coming from the business perspective. What's keeping you up at night when it comes to this election? Is it uncertainty? Is it that potential for policy change? Or is there more around how long is it going to take to get a coalition in place, and how stable is that coalition going to be? You are on mute, unfortunately.
Thank you, Gabrielle. A number of things concern me, as they do other colleagues in the business space. But having said that, there are certain areas where one is seeing some reason for hope and confidence. I think the broader areas that concern one and everyone else is just the high levels of unemployment, and especially youth unemployment. I think it's just not sustainable from a socio-economic stability point of view. The sooner that is addressed, the better. I mean, the second one is a point that Gabriela and Aurelien also mentioned around the low levels of growth, which are also not helpful in dealing with unemployment and also sorting out the other issues. And we're also seeing levels of investment also being low. And I think there's a lot that needs to be done to really try and encourage local and international investors to invest more in South Africa. I mean, having said that, I also see some international investors continuing to be interested in South Africa, coming in to look for opportunities and indeed allocating capital. And then furthermore, I mean, the triple challenges that we're all aware of energy, logistics, and crime and corruption concern us all. But what is also encouraging on that, I'm starting to see some green shoots, is that the work that the private sector is doing and working with government through Business for South Africa is starting to bear fruits. We've seen a full month without rotational power cuts, famously known as load shedding in South Africa. That's the first time, by the way, lest we forget, since January 2022, that we've had a full month of no load shedding in South Africa. So that's encouraging indeed. We're also seeing Transnet starting to be bullish and optimistic in raising their budgeted tonnage of exports through the ports and the railway system of South Africa, which has been challenged and has caused the mining industry and manufacturing and other sectors of the economy a lot. And also on the crime and corruption front, there's still challenges there, but we're also seeing the private sector input and involvement starting to help. So that's very, very encouraging. In terms of coalition politics, and I think the scenarios have been sketched very well by Nicky, and I'm not going to sort of repeat that. What I think, from my perspective, whatever the result is, it's very clear the ANC will be the single most dominant party, either at above 50%, in which it can rule on its own, or just below 50%, in which case it may need just a small party to get north of 51%. Or if the worst case scenario happens of the ANC being in the lower 40s or below 40, then they probably will need one of the bigger parties. It may either be the DA or the EFF or whatever combination of the other smaller parties. I mean, the good thing to really note here, as much as it is about the underperformance of the current administration and the ANC government over the past 8 years, we should also we see things in a positive way, that it's actually the consolidation of South African democracy. We're starting to see people demanding more from their governments and their administrators, wanting to get high levels of accountability. And I think the issue of uncertainty, yes, I hear it, but I think there is a cause for optimism that we can be certain that the constitutional democracy that we have that underpins our political system is entrenched. We've got an independent judiciary, continue to have a very robust and investigative media, got a very vibrant civil society, strong think tanks and universities. I happen to be involved in one of the big universities as chair of the University of Pretoria Council. So there is a culture of building and consolidating democracy that is there in our society. And I mean, I don't see us having trouble post the elections. Since 1994, all parties, they fight in the build up to the elections. Sometimes the fight is just so robust and adversarial, but we don't have a history of parties questioning the results of the elections or wanting to march, as we've seen in other parts of the world. The optimist in me says that will be the case again, but there is always room for surprises, and I hope we don't have surprises happening this time around.
It's always good to have an optimist on the panel as well. I think you've highlighted some really important points there, and I think the maturing of a democracy is definitely a case in point, and coalition governments is often a sign of that, provided they can agree on which direction they're all pulling in. I want to come back to you, Kuseni, on just one more question there. But before I do, I just want to remind everyone on the call to please post your questions in the chat. We will be turning to a Q&A in about 10 minutes or so. So please do ensure that your questions are ready for the panelists. You obviously mentioned some, you called them green shoots, some really positive initial sort of improvements that we're seeing under the ANC government, and that I think the panel seems to be in agreement that the ANC will continue to be the largest party in Parliament, whether part of a coalition or not. Do you foresee this, Kuseni, this election being a potential shock to the system for the ANC to really sort of re-energize those initiatives and drive them forward? Or is there a way in which we might see the sort of reversal of those green shoots?
Oh, that's a great question. Former President Kgalema Motlanthe once said that the ANC should lose elections so that they can go back to the drawing board and retrace their steps, as it were. I think this will be a shock to the ANC, the result, whatever it is. I think they'll be in the lower 50s, even if they win. And I see the ANC doing some serious soul searching and trying to go back to basics and trying to think how to best connect with the people of South Africa, if it wants to continue to be relevant in South African politics and not disappear into oblivion, as Junior was saying earlier on. And I see that even their own internal polling, it does seem to give them a wake-up call to indicate that people are unhappy with certain things and that need to be addressed, especially the levels of service delivery, the concerns around corruption, the issues around crime as well, which concern many people. And I think it will be a positive shock, in my view, that will enable or indeed force the ANC to think long and hard and even deeper on how best to be relevant in South Africa's unfolding political landscape, with an increase in the youth vote. And the youth does not buy, or indeed is not really constrained by the historical loyalty to the ANC, that it's a party of liberation and therefore must be cut more slack. And then the younger voters are demanding service delivery, demanding jobs, demanding accountability, as indeed they must, to keep the democracy alive and relevant and robust. So I hope this will be a good moment for the ANC and indeed for the other parties as well. I mean, what we see is also this mosaic of parties all over the place. And I hope that they will realize there is merit in uniting around a common objective and a sense of common purpose and vision that's relevant to the country, in order for them to increase their chances of being real alternatives to the ANC. What stands in the ANC's favor is the division that is there in the opposition. And I think the opposition parties will live to regret. I mean, I think this was a moment for a political project that is counter to the ANC to be formed and packaged and promoted and perpetuated to really challenge the ANC in power, but that's not going to happen. It's not happening. The ANC, yes, may have reduced number of votes, but they'll remain the dominant party. They'll have a big say in terms of the shape and form of the coalition government that's going to be formed after the elections.
Great, thank you. Of course, you can't mention the word shock without going back to the Economist on the panel. Obviously, shocks to the system, shocks to the economy will be of concern, specifically for business leaders in the country. Nicky, I want to come to you, just something that Junior raises, the Rand seems to have forgotten about the election. It's not as volatile as it was perhaps previously to some of the political movements in the country. There is this concern of potential social risks within the country. Are these the types of risks you're seeing being taken into account, or are other risks being priced into the market?
All right, so on the Rand, I think a key point to make there is that the Rand is exceptionally weak, all right? So it's very comfortable between that 18 to 20 Rand to the US dollar level. That is a very low level compared to where we were pre-pandemic. And
oh, I think we have cut your audio, Nicky. Can you hear us still? Nicky, can you hear us? We seem to have lost you. No, okay. I'm going to sort of potentially shoot the question over to Aurelien to see if what his sort of thoughts are in that space, if you want to, while we wait for Nicky to rejoin.
Yeah, as a rating agency, we don't make forecasts on the currency, but I prefer to tackle the social risk that you. Nicky is back.
Oh, there we go. She's back.
Okay. All right. So it seems that I've lost you. I hopefully everybody can hear me.
Yes, we lost you just as you had mentioned just how weak the Rand currently is.
Okay. So I'll go back a bit, and I think the reason we've seen the Rand now, the Rand is sort of, it's edging firmer, but it's not breaking ranges here. I think that's the important point to make. We see fair value for the Rand, in fact, somewhere between 1750 to 1850, and it's trading in more or less that sort of level at this point. And the main reason it's sort of slightly firmer has got to do with the dollar. And the dollar's been much more range bound. Everybody in the world is watching what the US Fed will do, like holding their collective breath to see will they cut by one, or will they cut once or twice, and when will the easing cycle start, or are we in a new world where you've got structurally higher levels of inflation, you've got greater inflation inertia, and as a result you need higher interest rates than we've seen before. That will have major implications for South Africa as well, but that's a story for another day. So I think the Rand at the moment has a lot more to do with the dollar. That doesn't mean the market will totally ignore the election. I think as we move closer to it, the attention will shift back. And there's always a knee-jerk reaction. The instability always manifests in the currency. So I think it will come. And then very importantly, what is to follow? And I mean, how long does it take? If there is a need for coalition, what's the nature of that coalition agreement? And, is it a stable coalition? So although a lot of that's been priced into the currency, I think you will still have those jitters manifest themselves going forward.
Thank you. That's sort of very, very helpful insights. And to that sort of second part of that question, Aurelien, around the social risk aspects, how are you sort of seeing this play out in the post-election scenario?
I think if one wants to look at the ESG consideration, social risk is probably the biggest risk facing the country. So it's very pervasive to the credit profile, because the new administration it affects every aspect of the credit rating. So, for example, you take the strength of the economy because of the high unemployment and the youth unemployment. You have crimes and violence and crimes data investment. You have also, when you look at the institutional strength of South Africa, the challenge to address some of the issues and the reforms is quite high. And now, if you look at the situation of the public finance, is the same. The social risk is weighing on the budget, the need to address social needs. I think Nicky mentioned the National Health Insurance Bill. These issues and these discussions are going to stay. The political instability also due to social risk. You have demonstration. You have you could have also a more difficult demonstration that could lead to what we saw 2 years ago in KwaZulu-Natal. But so the susceptibility to event risk that we follow is clearly challenged by this social risk. And of course, it could lead to more radical policies ultimately that could, again, have a negative impact on some of the capital inflows the countries rely on. But I think this, once it has been said, I think South Africa is a bit different than many democracies on the continent, where you had a lot of coups, a lot of, I would say, authoritarian regime. It's still, as mentioned by Kuseni, a functioning democracy, a court-based, a rule-based country, and it is likely that this democratic foundation, is going to continue. And there are also examples also on the continent when we see the successful democratic election in Senegal. So I would say that these elements are still also part of the strength of the sovereign, but at the same time, social risk is probably the biggest issue. In all its appearances, that the new administration will have to tackle over and the next administration too.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I think I want to open up to Q&A quite soon, but I want to just end off with a final question. Perhaps Junior, bring you back in there. Again, just taking it down to the sort of business perspective, are there any blind spots that perhaps we have not yet mentioned in this forum that businesses need to be prepared for, or at least have front of mind over the next few weeks? So as we lead into that vote, but then of course the first 2 weeks and subsequent weeks where a coalition will need to be formed.
Yeah, I think I tend to go with the previous speakers that South Africa is a noisy but stable democracy. We are rules based. We do have our excitement and our noise, but we finally settle down to play within the rules. But having said that, with the uncertainty that we face, one cannot rule out surprises. Particularly as I indicated, that a typical example would be one of the parties contesting the elections. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but one cannot rule it out. And then that puts us in a very new territory, because we also have to form a government. We've got 14 days plus 14, and then if there's a contestation of the elections, what does it mean? Can we do it within that window? What does it say to the confidence, particularly business confidence, if we find ourselves in that uncharted territory? Of course, the courts will be very busy, but it ups the ante on that issue of uncertainty once again. As I said in my earlier intervention, I don't see a KZN situation like we saw previously. I don't see that happening. Why I say that is the surprise element is gone. The intelligence and security cluster has probably been very busy making sure that doesn't happen. So I don't see huge surprises. Maybe some of the parties might be surprised by their results, but I don't see anything quite major from that, Gabi.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate all the insights that have been shared. I'm going to open up for Q&A now, as we have a few already lined up. So Kuseni, one has been sort of directed at you in the first instance. In relation to your comment around the ANC needing to lose in order to force a change is an interesting one. Is this a crisis of confidence, high unemployment, weakness of the rand, or is it really enough to drive sufficient change in the country?
Yeah, I think the country is crying out for change and is crying out for capable and competent and accountable leadership. And I think this election, the way it's so highly contested, the most contested in the past 30 years of liberation, just indicates how high the stakes are and the extent to which the ANC itself has to raise the level of its game in terms of service delivery and accountability. There is a view that the ANC was getting more complacent because it was taking the voters for granted, and then losing, therefore, would sort of be a good wake-up call and then remind them of the need to be accountable to voters, the need for them to pay attention to growing the economy, increasing levels of investment, and positioning South Africa as a globally attractive destination of local and international investment. And I think elections are important in that regard because they are part of the feedback loop from the electorate to ruling parties. And it's the only way and the only lever that we have to be able to give marching orders to political parties to remind them that they're serving at the mercy of the electorate. And I think that message will be a clear message to the ANC if they were to lose. And of course, it will still be because it's indications that their share of the vote will be less than the 57% they got in 2019.
Thank you. We have a question that's come through from an anonymous attendee. It's not directed at a particular panelist, but Nicky, I think it might fit well with you, but feel free to kick the ball on if you would like. What about having the PPP projects without providing sovereign guarantees? Won't this affect investors' appetite and trust in market stability?
I think this might be more for Aurelien than for me. He would know what it would mean for investor appetite. Yeah, I'm not sure what is meant by this without providing sovereign guarantees. I'm not sure exactly what is meant by this question. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, if you want the private sector to get more involved in providing infrastructure, you have to put up a framework that is fair to all parties involved and all parties taking a risk in a particular project. So it could potentially, if you don't provide any guarantees, it could potentially affect the appetite to partner with government. But I don't think it would extend beyond the point. The PPPs are very limited at this point. I'm not sure if this person is referring to the independent power producers, to those contracts. I'm not, whether we're talking about road infrastructure or just general PPPs. But I would assume that if you lose the guarantees, and certainly if you don't have a proper framework, that it could have a negative impact.
Thank you. Aurelien, do you want to come in there with a sort of broader?
I think Nicky said it all. I would just highlight that it doesn't matter, the framework it is used. South Africa is at a point where the government, the authorities, everybody that has looked at it knows that the private sector needs to be involved in the infrastructure needs, the network, for example, to transport electricity, the logistics sector, the partial privatization of, for example, the Durban port is an example where, you know, there is a change in the, I won't say ideology, but in the approach to give a larger place to the private sector, PPP or not PPP. South Africa has the luxury compared to many countries to have large pensions funds, to have a sophisticated capital market. So it has demonstrated in the past that when it's well coordinated, it's quite efficient in delivering major infrastructure or elements that are for other countries difficult to achieve. There are examples more recent, but the point of the importance of the private sector to be more supportive of the recovery and development of the economy is absolutely essential.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have a sort of a very broad question that's come in specifically around coalition dynamics. I'm going to ask the question, and then if anyone wants to jump in, panelists, please do. So Gary has said, a recent survey shows that DA supporters are more supportive of an ANC DA coalition than ANC supporters are. Why would this be the case, and what are the prospects for an ANC DA coalition?
So I'm happy to jump in and just say that from a policy perspective, if one looks at the suite of policies that the DA has and the ANC also has, there seem to be not many material differences. And I think the ANC under President Cyril Ramaphosa's leadership is seen as more of an acceptable political party with which to go into a coalition with. And it's interesting that the question highlights the fact that DA supporters are more in favor of a coalition with the ANC than the other way around. I think it's also relevant to point out that within the ANC, there are various schools of thought. There are those that actually are in favor of a coalition with the DA instead of the EFF. And that will be the sort of center, those people that are in the politics of the center, as it were, not to the far left. Those that are in the far left in ANC tend to favor a coalition with the EFF. So I think the ANC in its public pronouncements is also not ruled out the possibilities of going into a coalition with the DA. And I think business people will also find that to be more of a palatable and acceptable combination of parties or partners to work with and chart the cause of South Africa's economy going forward and grow the economy at higher levels of growth and also reduce unemployment, bring in more investment into the economy as well.
Great. Thank you. Yeah. And of course, the political holds too.
To that one, Gabi, I think the brain says that's the logical coalition that could take the country forward. But when one then boils it down to aspirations of the respective membership, let's take the fallout between the DA mainstream and My Money and other black members of the DA. It came about because there was a policy difference around the BEE policy. And most of the black members of the DA gave that as the reason they were leaving the party. So now if you bring that combination, how do you then meet and address the aspirations of the ANC members when it comes to transformation policies like BEE, and also bearing in mind that what has been referred to previously as the RET portion of the ANC is probably still alive and well within the ANC. So yes, for business and policy reasons, probably a logical, the brain says so, but the heart then says it might actually destroy both parties in the long run.
Thank you for that perspective.
I'll also quickly add there, I also think the reason, the ANC supporters are less enthusiastic about an ANC DA coalition is the fact that the DA aims to focus more on your sustainable development goals and scrap your more race-based empowerment policies.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nicky. I think I'm going to stop there on the Q&A. Apologies if we didn't get to your question. I just want to give the panelists 30 seconds each to just share their final thoughts or reflections on today's discussion. It was definitely insightful from my side. So perhaps, Aurelien, if you can give us 30 seconds of your final thoughts, and then we'll sort of run through the panel.
No, I think this election is very important for the continent as a whole. Given the role of South Africa as, I would say, a more developed and sophisticated economy and its weight on the continent. And I think everybody agrees that it should be a peaceful and well-organized election that will be happening in 2 weeks.
Great, thank you. Kuseni, your final 30 seconds.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a very exciting time. We're going through a crossroads of sorts, but I think we're going to emerge very strong. I'm joining this call from Rwanda, attending the Africa CEO Forum, and South Africa is still looked at as a beacon of hope for the rest of the continent. There are opportunities to develop and grow the rest of Africa through the African Continental Free Trade Area, through the power of the private sector across the continent. And South Africa has what it takes and has got the capacity to work with other African countries to be able to unlock the full economic potential of South Africa and the continent. And I think elections are key to enabling sustainable growth and robust private sectors to flourish and get sustained.
Thank you. Junior?
Thanks, Gabi. I think I got to my earlier view that what we're seeing here is a democracy that is maturing. We're seeing previously absolute majority party now facing the prospects of falling below 51%. And that's how democracy works. And that's how the electorate gives feedback to the ruling parties. I think what is going to be instructive here is how the ANC handles this prospect. I mean, look at West Africa, where we've had a number of coups because the population is frustrated with democracy. I think in terms of non-delivery, I think the way South Africa is going to handle this crossroads, if we can call it that, is going to be instructive and illustrative for the rest of the continent, because South Africa has always been seen as that leader in democracy. So this is a necessary test of the maturity of our democracy.
Thank you. And finally, Nicky, your 30 seconds.
Yes, I mean, I'm glad to see that everybody is optimistic and looking forward to greater accountability. I would say, there is always a risk that these things do not materialize. So I think we have to brace ourselves for a fair degree of uncertainty, probably for a bit of a waiting period before we know where we stand. I think we have a lot of things that work in our favor: an independent Reserve Bank that applies consistent monetary policy, a free press, which is always excellent, and certainly an independent judiciary and a strong civil society. And I think that is really what we can rely on, even as we are entering clearly something that is a very uncertain period in our history. But at the end of the day, political competition is a good thing. And I think the fact that we've gotten to this point where we are now speaking about that for the first time, I think is encouraging. And my biggest hope, and I'll just end with this, is that it truly results in greater accountability to the South African public. And in fact, probably the most important challenge for South Africa is to deal with empowering the most vulnerable, not the politically connected, but the most vulnerable in society.
Thank you. I think that it's sort of a great way to round it out. And while we're all hopeful around the maturing of our democracy, it is clear that there's challenges that needs to be faced, and hopefully the government of the day is up for those challenges. Thank you again, panelists, for sharing your insights with us so openly. You've given us much food for thought as we head to the ballot box in 2 weeks. I'm going to hand back over to Tutsi now just to close us out.
Thank you, Gabby. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of our speakers this afternoon for what was a very riveting conversation. I'd also like to thank our guests that have joined us for the last hour. I hope that there was something that you were able to take back that you will be able to apply to your businesses going forward. So from Invest Africa, we'd like to thank you and look forward to hosting you at our event in Cape Town next week around cross-border fintech. We'll also be in Nairobi for the AFDB annual meetings in the last week of May. And then lastly, we have our flagship event taking place in London on the 6th of June, the Africa Debate. So if anyone needs some additional information on that, please feel free to reach out to me. On that note, I will close off the session and have a good day, everyone. Thank you.